John Winston Lennon was a war baby. Born on October 9th, 1940, during the Battle of Britain, he was middle named after his country's fearless leader. Born during a war, John was always battling with others, inventing strife and conjuring controversy. Most of all, he was at war with himself. In his early years, John's trust in the people he loved was tested beyond the limits of his ability to form a truly secure attachment. Later in life, John would test the people who loved him, casting everyone he loved into an interpersonal theater of absurd and erratic behaviors, with he as director and star. Abandoned at different times and in different ways by both parents, John feared abandonment more than anything else. Yet he would deliberately hurt the ones he loved in order to evoke the very same reaction that terrified him. He was forever testing people to see how far and how hard he could push them before they left him, then reconfirming his expectations that the ones you love will always abandon or betray you. A pattern of interpersonal pessimism leading to the unconscious sabotage of intimate relationships that only then reconfirm his basic sense of mistrust in others. John Lennon's interpersonal theater of absurd behaviors and expectations has a long cast of characters. We'll begin with his father. John's father, Alfred Lennon, was despised by his in-laws, the Stanley family, as a drunk and a ne'er-do-well. The Stanleys deliberately estranged Alfred from his son John's life for his entire childhood. John began referring to his father as the ennoble Alf, accepting the basic premise fed to him by his mother and her sisters and parents, that John's father was good for nothing and should be avoided at all costs. The truth of the matter was not so clear-cut. Alf came from a very poor family. When his father died, his mother could not support all 8 of her children. So Alf was sent to an orphanage at the age of 9. His growth was stunted due to a childhood case of rickets, so he only grew to the height of 5'4". Though he had no musical education, he was naturally musical and a great singer. At 15, he passed the audition to become a member of a traveling musical act, so he ran away from the orphanage and hit the road, only to be found, returned to the orphanage, and severely beaten. Soon after, he met Julia Stanley. In 1938, when Alf was 26 and Julia 25, they married. None of the Stanley family were in attendance. Newlyweds couldn't afford a home of their own, so Julia stayed with her parents while Alf was mostly at sea. John, their only child together, was born 2 years later. Alf was away on duty for most of the war, his army paychecks dutifully sent back to Julia in Liverpool. But in 1943, the checks stopped. Alf was AWOL. He seemed to have disappeared for a couple of years, during which time Julia and the Stanley family wrote him off for dead, or as good as dead. When he finally returned to Liverpool in January of 1945, Julia was pregnant with another man's child. Alf wanted to settle down with his wife and son and the expected baby, but Julia and her family rejected him outright. The following year saw Julia falling in love with Bobby Dykins, a local wine steward and bartender. She and John moved in with Bobby, which raised a lot of issues, as she was still legally married to Alf. The Stanley family was aghast at the fact that Julia and her little boy were living in sin with Bobby, and that they were all sharing the same bed. By all accounts, this was a tumultuous time for John, as Julia was not a particularly responsible caregiver, and John would be bounced around from one aunt to another. At one point, John's eldest aunt, the formidable Aunt Mimi, decided that Julia was an unfit mother and that John was better off living with her, so she contrived a way to take John, despite the objections of both Julia and Alf. In 1946, 5-year-old John was living full-time with Aunt Mimi and her husband, Uncle George, who had no children of their own. Alf was given permission from Mimi to take John for a brief holiday to Blackpool. However, Alf was secretly planning to emigrate with his son to New Zealand. Julia and Bobby discovered Alf's scheme, and there was a confrontation in Blackpool. Alf invited Julia to come with him and John to New Zealand, but Julia would have none of it. Instead, a traumatized John was forced to decide whom he wanted to live with, his mother or his father. John wavered between the two, unable to decide, but in the end, he wound up going back to Liverpool with Julia, and ultimately, back to Mimi, who became his full-time caregiver for the rest of his childhood and adolescence. Discomfited, Alf returned to sea, not to be seen again until 1964. In the wake of Blackpool, John grew up with Aunt Mimi. "I didn't think much about my father growing up," John recalled. "It was as like he was dead." In 1966, at the height of Beatlemania, John and his father were briefly reacquainted in a media-driven reunion, a classic tabloid stunt, during which John was distant and frosty, saying only, "What do you want then?" to his father. What Alf really wanted was a few minutes to explain that he was asking for neither money nor help, just the opportunity to show his side of the story. John didn't give him much of a chance, cutting the reunion off short when he realized that Alf was getting a kickback from the newspapers. A year later, Alf turned up at John's home in Kenwood. John wasn't at home, but his wife, Cynthia, recognized him. She felt sorry for the man, who was clearly down and out of luck, so she invited him for tea and toast, and even cut his long, lanky hair, in an effort to make him appear more presentable. Cynthia knew firsthand just how nasty, critical, and judgmental Mimi and the other Stanley sisters could be, so she could sympathize with Alf's story. And she could understand that he was not the villain he was played out to be, a selfish drunk who coldly abandoned his son. John never came home that day, so Alf eventually left without seeing his son. John was not happy when he learned about the surprise visit. Later that year, around Christmas time, Alf recorded a single. John vindictively instructed Brian Epstein to use his record industry connections to make sure that his father's new single did not get distributed widely, thus destroying its ability to sell many copies. Though John was rightfully upset with Alf's opportunism, his father was very poor and John was very rich. John's act of sabotage against his father's attempt to make a few pounds to support himself seems unnecessarily spiteful and malicious. About a year or so later, there was a brief correspondence between father and son, which concluded with a handout. The Beatles were now the owners of a media corporation called Apple, and the solution for every problem was to put someone on the payroll and take care of it. John instructed his accountants to put his father on a £10 weekly stipend to pay the rent for a cheap one-bedroom flat for his father and, somehow, unsurprisingly, his father's new girlfriend, Pauline, who was just 19 years old and pregnant with his child. It was perhaps this roguish detail that softened John's heart. "He's a bit wacky," John admitted to Cynthia. "Like me." John's identification with his own father was doubtlessly aided by self-reflection. John himself had grown into an absentee father to his own son, Julian, and a deplorable husband to his wife, Cynthia. Unlike Alf, John had few excuses, such as an impoverished background, a childhood in an orphanage, a world war, life at sea due to a lack of options, and a brood of hateful Stanley sisters. Like Alf, Julia Stanley lived for wine and song, and she was known around Liverpool for being a lively pub singer and amateur comedienne who played the banjo and danced. As a free spirit and the baby sister of the family, Julia couldn't have been more different than Mimi, the eldest sister, who was conservative, strict, serious, and did not suffer fools gladly. It's rather clear that Mimi considered her younger sister and all of her consorts to be fools. When John was living with Julia and Bobby, Mimi found the situation so unseemly that she reported them to the Liverpool Welfare Department on 2 separate occasions to gain custody of John. Following the Blackpool incident, John returned to Liverpool to live with Julia and Bobby, but soon afterwards he was sent to Mimi's house again. It's clear that while Julia loved John, she couldn't give him the care and structure he needed, and would often give up on him, sending him off to Mimi's house or to one of his other aunts' homes. This ambivalence, she loved him but she gave him away, stayed with John for the rest of his life, and it would be recapitulated in John's ambivalence towards his own son, Julian, and in the absurd melodramatic theatrics that John would stage for his loved ones later on. Although never divorced from Alf, Julia had 2 daughters with Bobby, Julia and Jackie, John's half-sisters, who lived with their parents. The fact that his half-sisters lived with Julia but he didn't was another painful sticking point in John's life. Why did they get to stay with Julia while he was uninvited? John must have been acutely jealous of the love and attention given to Julia and Jackie by their mother and father. John couldn't help but feel abandoned and betrayed by both of his biological parents. John's relationship with Bobby, his mother's boyfriend, was strained and frosty at best, making him feel unwelcome. Nevertheless, John began seeing more of his mother when he was able to walk from Mimi's house to Julia's house on his own, often staying the night. He was around 14 years old at the time, and he was seriously getting into rock and roll. Mimi discouraged John's musical ambitions, while Julia not only supported John's musical development, she played along with he and his friends on the banjo and other instruments. Julia bought him his first guitar and taught John how to play, using banjo chords at first, and she allowed John and his bandmates to play their music loudly and wildly, an activity that was strictly forbidden at Mimi's house. Julia introduced John to the music of Elvis and gave him rock and roll records for presents. Perhaps the biggest encouragement came when Julia bought John a guitar, which had to be delivered to Julia's house, because Mimi would have surely refused delivery. John's friend and bandmate, Paul McCartney, recalled of his time with John at Julia's house. Julia would be very nice, but when we left there was always a tinge of sadness about him. In 1958, when John was 17, Julia was struck and killed by a car being driven by an off-duty police officer. John's half-sisters were sent off to live with an aunt in Scotland. Julia's untimely death thrust John into a pit of despair. He became angrier, darker, drunker, and much more aggressive. The abandonment issues he had with his mother were stirred up to a fever pitch and then never resolved. He hated her for abandoning him time and time again throughout his childhood, and now he hated her for abandoning him forever, in death. The premature death of his mother ensured that John would never resolve his trust issues with her, which means that his expectations for future intimate relationships would also be based on his ambivalent feelings towards an insecure attachment. For John, the model for a close, loving relationship would always be split between a good mother figure who was loving, affectionate, musical, and fun, and a bad mother figure who rejected and abandoned him to the care of Mimi, and who later abandoned him completely, just as they were beginning to get closer. The eldest and by far the most dominating of the 5 Stanley sisters was Mary, whom everyone called Mimi. Tough as nails, with a sharp wit and an even sharper tongue, Mimi was not to be trifled with. George Smith, John's uncle, was a mild-mannered dairy farmer and shopkeeper who could afford Mimi the upper-class lifestyle that she required. They married relatively late in life for the time. They were both 36, and the marriage was childless. Mimi had little interest in marriage or children, as she was extremely independent, having trained and worked as a nurse. Mimi's mother, Annie, the matriarch of the Stanley family, died in 1941, just a few months after her grandson John was born. Mimi ascended to the role of mater familias, and subsequently decided that her nephew John was not to be raised by her irresponsible baby sister Julia, whom she considered a disgrace, nor by her roguish brother-in-law, Alf, whom she despised. Though she never wanted children of her own, Mimi admitted she always wanted John. Auntie Mimi did what she had to do to get John away from his parents and under her charge. She threatened Alf, warning him to stay away from her home and from John, dangling his prison record and other disgraces over his head. Extracting John from the home of his biological mother and her boyfriend Bobby required a ruthlessness that surpassed normal concern. She called social services twice on her own sister and was ready to see John torn away from his mother's arms by government officials before seeing him raised by Julia. Mimi was tough. She could also be nasty and overcritical. John was a difficult child, always getting into trouble, but he was extremely bright and creative. Mimi focused on his poor behavior and bad grades, never seeming to have a kind word for him, and rarely supporting anything he wanted to do. Cynthia, John's future wife, recalled that Mimi battered away at John's self-confidence and left him angry and hurt. Rather than supporting his teenage obsession with rock music, Mimi mocked him, famously telling him time and time again, "Playing the guitar is all right as a hobby, John, but you'll never make a living at it." Years later, a Beatles fan had those ironic words inscribed on a steel plate and sent to John, who forwarded it to his auntie. Nothing John did was ever good enough for Mimi. She was particularly disdainful of his male friends and female partners. Mimi disapproved of Cynthia, considering her family to be beneath her own, and was constantly putting her down in front of John. When John had been married, she was not in attendance. Years later, when John introduced Mimi to his second wife, Yoko, Mimi glanced at her and asked, "Who's the poisoned dwarf?" Nevertheless, of his four parental figures, Alf, Julia, Mimi, and George, Mimi was the only one who never left, died, or abandoned him in any way. Though she was difficult, controlling, withholding of tenderness and affection, and overly critical, she cared for John consistently and always provided him with the safety and security of a stable and loving, if not affectionate, home. Perhaps it was because of this that John never inflicted his absurd tests and mind games on his auntie. Or perhaps he just knew better than to mess with her. John was all too aware that she was just as tough as him and twice as ruthless. He wound up being raised by Mimi because she was the strongest lead character in the theater of the absurd that was John's childhood. Mimi was the only character willing to go to any means necessary to get exactly what she wanted. John. Consequently, John learned to equate love with power, an absurd equation that would result in a lifetime of socio-emotional miscalculation. John's relationship with his custodial uncle, George Smith, was very close and unambivalent. While John had other father figures in his life, Uncle George was the only one who never betrayed or abandoned him in any way, and the only one who gave him unconditional positive regard. Bobby Dykins, Julia's longtime live-in lover and father to John's two half-sisters, tolerated John's presence, but treated him more like a visitor than a son. John certainly never considered Bobby a father figure. When Bobby died in a car crash on Penny Lane in Liverpool in 1965, John made no remarks, nor did he attempt to attend the funeral or show any sign that he even cared. Uncle George, on the other hand, treated his nephew as if he were his own son. Unlike Mimi, George was affectionate with John. They would hug and give each other little squeakers or kisses. Uncle George listened to little John's flights of fancy without criticism. He played games with him, took him on day trips, read him bedtime stories, taught him to draw, and he also encouraged John's love for music, by getting him his first musical instrument, a harmonica. John would later attribute his love for reading, writing, and drawing to his beloved uncle. George's death was probably the impetus for John to get closer to his mother, Julia, that year. To get the love, affection, and emotional support that was withheld from him by Mimi. For years after George's death, John would wear his uncle's old wartime coat everywhere, even though it was far too big on him. By the age of 15, John had been abandoned 3 times. Death took away his beloved mother and uncle, while Mimi, fate, and other obstacles separated him from his biological father. John would spend the rest of his life putting the people he loved through absurd tests of loyalty to see if they would abandon him too. John's closest friends were intimately acquainted with the elemental paradox of his character. John's tough, teddy boy persona projected arrogance, dominance, and insolence. Only the very few who got close to him knew that John was incredibly insecure, and that the tough guy routine was just an act, put on for a world he could not trust. One psychosocial quirk of John's that revealed his deepest insecurity was his fear of doing anything by himself. His friend and biographer Ray Connolly noted that John always needed a partner in crime, a special partner in his adventures, especially if the adventure entailed mischief, which was usually the case. John needed a buddy to accompany him on his various escapades, someone he could boss around, as John always had to be in charge, someone to witness his outlandish deeds and laugh at his subversive gags, as John always had to be making trouble, and someone to support his performance, as John always had to be in the spotlight. In the early years, John's sidekick and best friend was Pete Shotton. In his autobiography, Pete recalls that John desperately needed the supportive presence of whoever he was closest to at the time. In school, John drew a comic book called The Daily Howl, which consisted of his anti-authoritarian and absurd jokes, poems, stories, and grotesque drawings. Issues of The Daily Howl were created by John primarily to amuse Pete and himself. When the skiffle craze hit England, John pressed Pete into service in his skiffle group, which he named the Quarrymen, as they attended the Quarrybank High School. At the heart of the Quarrymen were John on guitar and Pete on washboard. Eventually, John enlisted Paul McCartney and George Harrison to the Quarrymen, which morphed into a rock and roll band. When Pete, who never asked to be a musician in the first place, quit the band, John, in typical fashion, threw a temper tantrum, smashing the washboard over Pete's head, destroying Pete's instrument and making him unable to play in the band even if he wanted to. Pete later admitted that he quit the Quarrymen because of the developing musical collaboration between John and Paul. The pair really clicked in the way they wrote, sang, and performed music, and it was difficult for others, such as Pete and George, to wedge their way into that tight dyad. John and Paul met in 1957. John was 16, Paul had just turned 15. John heard Paul playing an Eddie Cochran song and immediately recognized his talent, so he invited him to join the Quarrymen, and Paul accepted. Paul had lost his mother to cancer in 1956 when he was just 14. When John lost his mother in 1958, they connected through an unspoken bond of mutual grief and mourning. By 1960, the Quarrymen had become the Beatles, with John and Paul on lead vocals and rhythm and bass guitars, George Harrison on lead guitar and backup vocals, and Pete Best on drums. At the core of the band was the harmonic blend of John's somewhat acerbic singing voice with Paul's full and warm voice, what producer George Martin referred to as John's lemon juice mixing with Paul's virgin olive oil. The creative competition between Paul and John inspired each other to greater heights. John referred to it as their sibling rivalry. The writing partnership John made with Paul at a very young age was the key to the success of the Beatles. But John could never have foreseen that he would one day find himself trapped by his own success. Erik Erikson's construct of identity foreclosure refers to a person who feels trapped in an identity that they committed to when very young, before they could explore or even become aware of their own options. When the Beatles became the biggest band ever, John's dream come true became a cage barred with fame, prosperity, and both personal and professional obligations. Simply leaving the Beatles was not an easy proposition, as he'd not only be disappointing and financially harming close friends and partners, such as Paul, George, Ringo, Brian Epstein, and George Martin, he'd also be breaking the hearts of an entire world of fans. In 1965, each of the Beatles was awarded an MBE, the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire Award, by the Queen herself, as the Crown's recognition of the fact that the Beatles, as an international act, was so financially successful that their taxed earnings provided a windfall to the UK government. At the time, the tax rate for the highest earners in England was 95%. If John broke up the Beatles, he would quite literally be inflicting financial harm onto the entire United Kingdom. By the mid-1960s, John's songwriting partnership with Paul had become strained, as John and Paul were diverging in terms of musical style and taste. Prior to 1965, John and Paul typically wrote together, eyeball to eyeball, in John's words. By the time of the White Album, this intimacy had vanished, and Paul and John wrote separately, bringing their completed songs to the studio to be performed by the band and recorded. But while John and Paul were writing and composing separately, all of their songs were still considered Lennon-McCartney songs, as per their original contractual agreement. The notion that every song he would ever write would be considered to be half written and half composed by Paul was a fact that stuck in John's craw, especially because Paul and he were becoming so divergent in their musical taste and styles. John was also painfully aware that Paul was a much more prolific writer than he was, that Paul had a preternatural ability for melody that surpassed his own, that Paul was a more accomplished and versatile musician, and had a fuller and richer singing voice, and also that Paul's songs were more commercially successful and accessible to mass audiences than John's own, as seen in the fact that when singles were released, Paul's song was almost invariably the A-side, while John's song would be relegated to side B. All of these factors made John feel insecure in his own songwriting ability and musicianship as compared to Paul. By the late 1960s, John was feeling trapped in his partnership with Paul and the Beatles. He knew that in order to fully develop as a songwriter, a recording artist, and as an individual, he would need to develop beyond his Beatle identity and become his own man. John met Stu Sutcliffe at the London College of Art in 1959. John was impressed. Stu was an amazingly talented artist, an excellent student, very good-looking, and extremely well-dressed. As a fan of rock music, Stu was mutually impressed by John's musical ability and his whole rock and roll look and identity. The two became close friends and roommates. Just as he did with Pete Shotton, John enthusiastically browbeat his new best friend Stu to be in his band, the Quarrymen, until Stu finally gave in, even though Stu couldn't sing or play an instrument. John had Stu play the bass, which, at the time, was considered to be the easiest instrument for a novice to pick up. Paul and George were unhappy about the addition of Stu to the group. Stu wasn't a musician, but more importantly, he was becoming much closer to John than they were, as he was the same age as John, he was in art school with John, and he lived with John in the same flat. Paul, in particular, felt displaced by Stu's entry into the band, as his special songwriting connection with John was now taking a backseat to John's new artistic connection with Stu. For his part, Stu tried hard to learn the bass, buying a new bass guitar, and he helped out by booking gigs for the band and holding rehearsals in his flat. He and John renamed the band the Beatles. In 1960 and 1961, the band completed extended engagements at the Kaiserkeller and Indick clubs in Hamburg, Germany. Stu quit the band in 1961 after earning a scholarship to study at the Art Institute of Hamburg, where he lived and studied with his new German fiancée, Astrid Kircher, whom he met at the Kaiserkeller while playing with the Beatles. Stu's departure opened the way for Paul to take over the bass guitar, and re-cemented the close musical bond between he and John. Tragically, Stu died a year later, in 1962, of a brain aneurysm at the age of 21. John was utterly distraught when he learned of Stu's passing, breaking down completely. Only those who didn't know John well were surprised by the violent intensity of his grief, as he usually hid behind a front of tough arrogance and cool cynicism. The only person in their circle who grieved as fervently as John was Astrid. First his mummy left him, Astrid explained, then Stuart. I think it was the root of his anger, that people he loved the most always left him. Shortly after Stu died, the Beatles recorded their first single for EMI at Abbey Road Studios in London, and the rest, as they say, is history. Throughout his life, John had always known that he was different from others. I'm either a genius or I'm mad, John would say of himself. After years of struggling and fighting with his aunt, his teachers, and himself, he finally proved to the world that his dream was not just an adolescent fantasy. His ambitions were finally vindicated and validated. What success does for you, John said in an interview, is it gives you a real feeling of confidence in yourself. With confidence in oneself, however, comes self-reflection. In a 1971 interview for Rolling Stone magazine, John said, "One has to completely humiliate oneself to be what the Beatles were, and that's what I resent." I didn't know, John continued. I didn't foresee. It happened bit by bit, gradually, until this complete craziness is surrounding you, and you're doing exactly what you don't want to do with people you can't stand, the people you hated when you were 10. John was not a businessman by any stretch of the imagination, and was ill-suited for management. When Brian Epstein came along in 1961, John, who had just turned 21, was more than happy to hand over all management and business-related matters to him. John respected Brian's business acumen and trusted him implicitly with the development of his band's musical career. John also discovered that Brian was utterly dependable, very smart, extremely organized, totally devoted and committed to supporting each member of the band artistically and personally, and completely loyal and protective of his clients. In other words, Brian was the perfect father figure for John. Brian not only supported John's musical ambitions, but was an equal partner in nurturing them. Most importantly, Brian was an adult man that John could trust completely. They became extremely close, and Brian soon took on a fatherly role in John's life, though he was only 6 years older. Brian was the best man at John's wedding to Cynthia, hosting the very small wedding reception which Mimi did not attend in protest. When Cynthia gave birth to their son, Julian, Brian arranged and paid for a private room in a hospital for her. As Cynthia was unliked and not treated very well at all by Mimi, Brian also let her and the baby live in his flat in Liverpool. John asked Brian to be Julian's godfather, a request that Brian joyfully granted. When Brian died of an accidental drug overdose in 1967, the Beatles were distraught, and John was utterly devastated. For the Beatles, Cynthia explained, Brian had been guide, mentor, friend, big brother, and father figure. For John, Brian's death was yet another repetition of the psychosocial pattern in his life, in which he would become extremely attached to someone, only to lose that person in a tragic way. It was almost a love affair, John later said of his connection with Brian, but not quite. It was never consummated, but it was a pretty intense relationship. John felt guilty for introducing Brian to the recreational drugs that he would later overdose on, and also for teasing Brian, often mercilessly, for being both Jewish and gay. When Brian revealed that he was planning on writing his autobiography, he asked the band if they had any ideas for the title. John suggested Queer Jew. When Brian decided on A Cellar Full of Noise as his title, John quipped, "It should have been called A Cellar Full of Boys." For the Beatles, Brian's death was the beginning of the end. Without a strong and stable father figure for the band, there was nobody with the authority to make unilateral decisions, nobody to reconcile differences within the band, and nobody to tell John to stop it when his confrontational and deliberately provocative behaviors created an environment so toxic that even the greatest rock and roll band of all time could not survive it. Brian was the only person John trusted implicitly, the only person with authority that he would actually listen to and follow. Brian's death not only opened the void in the center of the Beatles, it reopened the wound in John's heart, a wound that John would try to heal with drugs and false mentors. In 1967, George Harrison became deeply engrossed in Eastern spirituality and mysticism. His interest, inspired by his use of LSD and the zeitgeist of psychedelic transcendentalism, spread to John and the other Beatles. At the time of Brian's death, the Beatles were in Bangor, Wales, attending a meditation seminar conducted by the Indian yogi and mystic Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The news of Brian's death was a mortal blow to the band. John recalled, "I didn't have any misconceptions about our ability to do anything other than play music. I was scared. I thought, we fucking had it now." At their time of trouble, John and the band looked to the Maharishi for guidance and wisdom. He became the spiritual advisor to the Beatles. With Brian gone, Cynthia explained, the four needed someone new to give them direction, and the Maharishi was in the right place at the right time. George and John leapt headfirst into transcendental meditation under the personal instruction of the Maharishi. Soon they were leading Paul and Ringo and everyone's wives and girlfriends to India to study with the Maharishi in his ashram in Rishikesh. The time spent in India was relaxing and educational for the group. They learned a lot about meditation, and they composed many of the songs that would appear on their next album. However, following a misunderstanding in which John was led to believe that the Maharishi had made sexual advances towards the actress Mia Farrow, John was instantly disillusioned. He abruptly walked out of the ashram, followed by most of the Beatles' entourage. When the Maharishi asked him, "Why are you going?" John's infamous reply was, "If you're so cosmic, you'll know why." John's brief fascination with the Maharishi revealed his pattern with mentors and father figures. Initial optimism, fueled by a hope that the man may inspire John or truly help him to figure himself out, followed quickly by disillusionment. Every man he thought he could trust or admire, from his own father to Elvis, Bob Dylan, and Maharishi, either left or disappointed him in some way. John met Cynthia Powell at the Liverpool College of Art in 1959. He was 18 and she was 19. In a classroom, shortly before class began, he grabbed his guitar and serenaded her with an impromptu rendition of Ain't She Sweet. They soon fell in love. John was still reeling from the loss of his mother the previous year, and Cynthia was still mourning the loss of her father, who also died the previous year. In John, Cyn found a man to replace the love once directed towards her adoring father. In Cynthia, John found a woman to replace the love once directed to his cherished mother. The extreme intimacy of first love recapitulates the trust issues experienced in childhood. John's insecure attachment with his mother evoked jealousy issues that were displaced onto Cynthia. John was extremely, and on occasion, violently possessive and jealous of Cynthia. John was provoked to fury, Cynthia recalled, if another boy paid any attention to me, however innocent. On one occasion, he beat her severely, merely because he saw her dancing with his friend, Stu Sutcliffe, at a party. Cynthia broke up with him over that, and John had to win her back. When Cyn revealed to John in 1962 that she was pregnant with their baby, John did the right thing by marrying her, but it wasn't a shotgun wedding. They were truly in love. By the time Julian turned 5 in 1968, neither of them seemed happy with their marriage. But the biggest change in our lives during this time, according to Sin, and the biggest single factor that led to our breakup, was John's deepening interest in drugs. After their first acid trip, when they were dosed unknowingly by their dentist, Cynthia recalls that John took LSD regularly. He felt it gave his life a whole new dimension. The other Beatles were much more cautious, but John threw himself into it with abandon, convinced that this was the way to greater enlightenment, creativity, and happiness. When John was tripping, she felt as if she was living with a stranger, in her words. He would be so distant, so spaced out that he couldn't talk to me coherently. Cynthia was a first-hand witness to the fact that John was indeed ingesting acid on a daily basis for extended periods of time. Cynthia recalled, LSD was pulling him away from me. I wouldn't take it with him, so he found others who would. By late 1968, Cynthia said, our love life had definitely disappeared by then. John was sexually impotent with Sin, due to being perpetually on acid, and also because of his other lovers, including Yoko Ono. One day, Sin returned home from a holiday to find John and Yoko sitting on the floor in the sunroom, cross-legged, wearing only towels, facing each other. All John said was, "Oh, hi." John and Yoko remained motionless, as if Sin wasn't even there. Cynthia was speechless, stunned, unable to process the horror of the situation, and unable to understand why her once loving husband was being so deliberately vicious and cruel to her. John and Yoko had apparently decided that they were soulmates on every level, which included music and songwriting as well. Divorce would soon follow for John and Cynthia. And for the Beatles as well, because the cement bond that held the group together at the core, the collaboration between John and Paul, was torn asunder. Cynthia saw what was happening, but was helpless to stop it. Cynthia said, Yoko had replaced me as John's wife, and Paul as his artistic collaborator. John not only wanted to separate from Cynthia, he wanted to punish her as well, even though she was clearly the injured party. He cut off all lines of communication between he and Sin and Julian. In order to reach John, one now had to go through Yoko, as she was in charge of all communications between she and John and anyone outside of that exclusive, tiny, two-person bubble. Their last phone conversation before the finalization of their divorce was about the settlement. According to Sin, John said, "My final offer is $75,000. You're not worth any more." The final settlement was eventually set at £100,000, which is less than $2 million in today's money, to be spread out over the next 15 years, terminating when Julian turned 18. Certainly not very much, considering John's enormous wealth. Alimony and child support payments were so small that Cynthia would have to worry about having enough money to support herself and Julian, and there were no provisions made for Julian's education. Cynthia and Julian were both left out of John's will. While John and Yoko lived the jet-set lifestyles of rock star tycoons. Clearly, a transference of love and affection had taken place in John's heart. When John fell in love with Cynthia, he projected all of his love for his beloved departed mother onto her. When John fell in love with Yoko, he transferred that projected love onto her. And so all that was left for John to feel towards Cynthia were the negative associations he held towards his mother. His anger and hatred for being abandoned and rejected throughout his childhood, the primordial wound at the root of his insecure identity. And the final blow, the ultimate abandonment, when Julia left John forever, leaving the wound unhealed and unbound. Only that level of displacement and transference could explain his otherwise inexplicable cruelty towards Cynthia, and his concurrent passion and single-minded devotion towards Yoko, which seemed boundless. In John's confused and acid-addled mind, Cynthia became the archetypal wicked stepmother, deserving of nothing but scorn, while Yoko became the fairy godmother, infused with all the positive associations he still held for Julia. In July 1962, John's girlfriend, Cynthia, informed him that she was pregnant. "There's only one thing for it, Cyn," John said. "We'll have to get married." They wedded a month later. The baby was named John Charles Julian Lennon, after John's deceased mother, Cynthia's deceased father, and John himself. Fatherhood is the biggest responsibility in a man's life, and John, who was just 22 years old when Julian was born, was not prepared for it at all. Though John loved Cyn and wanted to do the best by her, he was simply not ready for marriage and parenthood, making his role as husband and father another foreclosed identity, which he would eventually rebel against and ultimately reject. John also hadn't resolved his own issues with his biological father. Alf was a poor model of fatherhood, and John would act very similarly towards his own son, repeating the sins of his father. Julian was born just as Beatlemania struck, so John was rarely at home with Julian. When John divorced Cynthia in 1968, he essentially abandoned his son as well. "After the age of 5, Julian recalled, "when my parents separated, I saw him only a handful of times, and when I did, he was often remote and intimidating. I grew up longing for more contact with him, but felt rejected and unimportant in his life." Paul McCartney saw how devastated Julian was by his parents' divorce and his father's disaffection, so he wrote a song for Julian as a sympathetic gesture of support. Originally titled "Hey Jules," the song was eventually renamed "Hey Jude" because it hit the ear better, but the message of caring love and support for a sad and lonely child remained clear. 3 years later, in 1971, John forsook England for America and moved to New York. According to Cynthia, there was no word from John between 1971 and 1974. He wouldn't see Julian at all for those years. Julian never understood why his father abandoned him. He once said, "Dad was a hypocrite. He could talk about peace and love to the world, but he could never show it to his wife and son." Julian remarked to his mother, "Dad's always telling people to love each other, but how come he doesn't love me?" Though John did love Julian, he was so ill-equipped for fatherhood that he couldn't express it. At the time, John was unable to reconcile his own unwillingness to becoming a father and his own resentfulness at having fatherhood thrust upon him with his actual love for Julian. John remarked once in an interview that he and Julian were Saturday night specials because they both came out of a bottle of whiskey on a Saturday night. John was introduced to Prellies in Hamburg. Phenmetrazine was an amphetamine that was popular among the seamen and truck drivers who frequented the Hamburg clubs and used speed to keep them awake during their long work hours. The Beatles were expected to perform all night in the Kaiserkeller, so they used Prellies to keep them awake and to boost their energy levels on stage. John imported this habit back to England, where amphetamines of all kinds were also popular and widely available, and he continued to depend on speed to keep him going throughout the Beatlemania period. Like everyone else he knew, John was introduced to alcohol in his early teens, and he loved to drink. Unfortunately, John was not a good drinker. When he drank, John got drunk very quickly and would transform into a stumbling, bumbling, angry, irritable, offensive, fight-starting lush. Combining Prellies with alcohol made matters worse for John, as it enabled him to drink even more without passing out or falling into a drunken stupor. In 1964, John and the Beatles met Bob Dylan in a New York hotel room. Dylan rolled a few joints and passed them around. The Beatles had never smoked pot before, but it soon became their drug of choice. They would later admit that they were stoned for the entire filming of the second Beatles movie, Help, as well as for the entire recording of their 1965 album, Rubber Soul, which they sometimes referred to as the Pot Album. John would later recall his stoner period as his Fat Elvis period. He said, "I was eating and drinking like a pig, I was depressed, and I was crying out for help. It's real, and I meant it." "I've always needed a drug to survive," John admitted in an interview. "The others too, but I always had more. More pills, more of everything. Because I'm more crazy, probably." In March of 1965, John and George and their wives attended a dinner party at their dentist's house. The dentist surreptitiously spiked their coffee with LSD. At the time, the poorly understood substance was considered a wonder drug that could open one's inner eye to new dimensions of reality and existence. While they all shared a terrifying experience on their first acid trip, Cynthia and Patty were turned off by the intensity of the drug, while John and George were intrigued and wanted to engage in further experimentation. John later admitted that he dropped acid on a daily basis throughout the mid-1960s. LSD, he said, went on for years. "I must have had 1,000 trips. I used to just eat it all the time." Few people knew at the time that John's 1965 single, Day Tripper, was a paean to daily acid ingestion. While 1965's Rubber Soul was considered the Beatles' pot album, 1966 Revolver was dubbed their acid album. The lyrics to John's song Tomorrow Never Knows, the final track on Revolver, were meant to act as instructions for how to experience LSD, while the music itself was meant to evoke the physical and psychological sensations of tripping. The opening lyrics to the song, "Turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream," were lifted directly from Timothy Leary's book, The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, published in 1964 and co-authored by Ralph Metzner and Richard Albert. Leary knew from his research in the field of hallucinogens that LSD could be extremely dangerous if taken without proper guidance. Rather than warning young people about the hazards of the drug, Leary insisted that everyone in the world, especially young people, should try the drug in order to experience new levels of reality and open their minds to new ways of being. Leary's book was designed as a novice's guide for tripping. In his introduction to the 1992 edition of Leary's book, Daniel Pinchbeck noted the naive and overly optimistic attitude towards LSD that existed in Leary's time. Today, Pinchbeck wrote, "It is hard for us to imagine that long ago moment when Ivy League professors, established intellectuals, film stars, famous poets, and millionaires sincerely believed that the exploration of non-ordinary states of consciousness through chemical means could induce a radical transformation of the individual and the society." As a so-called Pied Piper of the acid generation, Leary's book was the only publication that offered some guidance to novice LSD users who were not taking the drug as prescribed, instructed, and monitored by a psychiatrist or experienced therapist. The cardinal metaphor of the psychedelic experience was that an acid trip was akin to death, as it evokes a sense of psychological disassociation that could be interpreted by the user as a temporary death of the conscious ego. So, if tripping, metaphorically, is like dying, then a spiritual guide for the dying could be adapted as a psychological guide for the tripping. Leary and his co-authors transposed the rituals from the ancient Tibetan Book of the Dead into a manual for using LSD to evoke the transcendent state of ego death. The problem is, the metaphor made between the acid trip and ego death is not at all apt. The ancient Tibetans were exploring the concept of spiritual rebirth through meditation and prayer, which has absolutely nothing to do with the neurological effects of a synthesized chemical. If read from a psychological perspective, Leary's book is pseudoscience in the guise of self-help. If read from a spiritual perspective, the book is a rehash of Eastern spiritual philosophies, sloppily superimposed onto an equally misconstrued understanding of the psychedelic experience. If read literally, the book is a recipe for psychological self-destruction. John said in an interview, "I got a message on acid that you should destroy your ego, and I did. I was reading that stupid book of Leary's and all that shit, and I destroyed myself." Everybody knows about John Lennon's statement to a journalist in March 1966, in which he commented that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus. This simple, accurate observation, taken out of context and reprinted a million times over, created havoc in the US, where the Bible Belt was still buckled tightly around the entirety of Middle America. What few knew at the time was that John's blundering misstatement was made while he was on acid, and that it represented a process of deep spiritual thinking that John was immersed in during that time. John took Leary's acid-inspired ego death stuff very seriously. He did truly believe that he had destroyed his ego identity as John Lennon, and he was desperately trying to reconstruct a new unified sense of self. In 1968, 2 years after the more popular than Jesus fiasco, John was tripping with his old friend, Pete Shotton, when he turned to him and said, "I've got something important to tell you. I think I'm Jesus Christ." According to Pete, this was not a joke. John was dead serious. John and Pete hurried to Beatles headquarters at Apple offices in London to arrange for a press release regarding the glorious second coming of the Lord. Fortunately, the Beatles knew that John was just tripping balls, and a statement, of course, was never released. Imagine the reaction in the States to the headline, "John Lennon declares that he is the second coming and resurrection of Jesus Christ." Notwithstanding John's identity confusion and drug-addled mental state, his Messiah complex was not completely unjustified. As a Beatle, John was literally worshipped around the world by millions. What troubled John in particular was that the entrance to each show was always lined with invalids in wheelchairs, who flocked to Beatles concerts in the same way that the sick flooded to faith healers, hoping that the glance or touch of a living God would grant them heavenly grace from their afflictions. John's experience of being revered like a god, merged with the ego distortion of heavy LSD use, created a completely untethered sense of identity. John's missionary-like zeal for spreading the word of peace and love inspired him to write hippie anthems such as "All You Need Is Love" and "Give Peace a Chance." Those anthems and others rallied the troops of millions of young people who were inspired by John's words and music to protest the war in Vietnam and bring about social justice and change for everyone. So, while John was not the actual Messiah, he was the premier spokesperson for his generation, using his godlike status and God-given talent to compose inspirational anthems that spread the divine word of peace and love throughout the world. In the final analysis, isn't that the societal role that the Messiah figure is supposed to play? John spent the 1960s searching for a Messiah for his own confused self, and in the process, he became a Messiah figure to an entire generation. According to John and George, the primary attraction of the Maharishi was that he offered a means of achieving the dissociative feeling of ego death experienced through acid via a non-pharmaceutical process of transcendental meditation. By 1968, both George and John had undergone many terrifying bad trips and were becoming wary of acid use. The Maharishi's promise of drug-free transcendence sounded great, especially right after Brian Epstein died from his overindulgence in recreational drugs. After becoming disenchanted with the Maharishi, John relapsed into frequent acid dosing. Transcendence, liberation from ego and space-time limits, attainment of mystical union. These were the goals of the psychedelic experience. According to Leary's stupid little book, John nevertheless believed that he did destroy, or at least lose, his sense of self somewhere on his many, many trips. John truly believed that John Lennon died, dissociated in acid, and that he was reborn via the mystical union of his identity and another's. After returning from the ashram in India in 1968, where John was drug-free for a couple of months, John got back into LSD with a vengeance, finding a traveling partner in conceptual artist Yoko Ono. In Yoko, John found a woman as fearless and reckless as he was in every situation. Whether it was doing drugs, making music, or engaging in any other form of creative expression, They pushed each other's limits and challenged each other in ways that nobody else could. At one point, under the pressure of a lot of acid, they pushed against each other so hard that they became one. The combination of falling in love, finding a soulmate, a lifelong need to attach with a mother figure, and the dissociative effects of lots and lots of LSD promoted a mystical union between John and Yoko. A mutual simultaneous disassociation from their individual identities, ego death, followed by a mutual rebirth, in which John and Yoko were reborn as one person. "I finally found someone as barmy as I am," John told his friend Pete Shotton. For the first time in his life, John found a partner in crime who matched his fearlessness and recklessness. As John was forsaking his wife and 5-year-old son with Yoko, Yoko was abandoning her husband, Tony Cox, and their 5-year-old daughter, Kyoko, for John. As a conceptual artist, everything Yoko did was designed for an audience to question the concept behind the act. She could care less that her singing was atonal, her musicality non-existent, and her artwork unappealing. Yoko would still perform and create, regardless of how much people disliked her or her act. John absolutely loved that about Yoko. He found it inspiring. After over a decade of hard days' nights, working his tail off to please fans, critics, and colleagues alike, he'd reached the top. But at what cost? Everybody loved the Beatles, but John wanted more than love. He wanted to challenge his audience, like Yoko did in her performance art. It was the same old pugnacious uncertainty. How far could he push his fans, his friends, his family, his lovers, before they leave him? But now the testing was played out on the world stage. It was a mindfuck on a global scale. And only John and Yoko were in on the joke. If John and Yoko were generating karma for their actions, their cruelty to their own children and spouses, John's deliberately confusing and frustrating behavior that vexed and alienated his bandmates, especially Paul, but also the millions of fans who loved and worshipped him, then the karma they would receive would not be instant, but delayed. Following their mutual rebirth and baptism in acid, John and Yoko very deliberately went about to merge their egos into one. They became joined at the hip, like infant and mother. They were never seen apart from late 1968 through 1971, when they moved from England to New York. Yoko not only replaced Cynthia as John's primary love object and mother figure, she also replaced Brian as John's personal and professional manager. She also replaced Paul as John's creative partner, while also replacing Pete Shotton as John's tripping buddy and sidekick. John's insistence that Yoko be by his side at all times, even while the Beatles were recording, and his insistence that Yoko have an equal part in everything he did, including making music on the Beatles records, distanced his bandmates, leading ultimately to the breakup of the band. Paul recalls that the intimacy he shared with John as songwriting partners was totally destroyed by the wedging of Yoko into the middle of what was once a tight dyad. Though Yoko is often blamed for breaking up the Beatles, Yoko would not have been an issue. If John hadn't decided that he was no longer John Lennon, but merely half of John and Yoko, and then demanding that everyone accept Yoko as half of himself, which was an absurd demand, then the Beatles would not have disbanded. "I'm always John and Yoko," John explained in an interview. "That never stops. So whatever I'm doing as a Beatle, Yoko is sitting on my shoulder as a parrot." In retrospect, John insisted, "I started the band, I disbanded it. It's as simple as that." The merged persona of John and Yoko always wore the same matching white suits. They had the same center-parted long hairstyle. Their first joint art project was an experimental film made on acid, in which the images of their faces were merged into one. John legally changed his name from John Winston Lennon to John Ono Lennon. As his injured psyche retreated behind the protection and control of Yoko, John's friends and family lost touch with him, because anyone who wanted contact with John had to go through Yoko, a psychosocial wall that both protected and distanced John from the outside world. By late 1968, all of John's music, both with and without the Beatles, included Yoko. John and Yoko formed the Plastic Ono Band. Most of John's non-Beatles music from 1968 through 1974 was made by the Plastic Ono Band. Thread by thread, John and Yoko unraveled the tapestry of John Lennon's ego identity. Pete Shotton quit his job as John's assistant when he was ordered to clean up Yoko's flat, effectively dissolving their lifelong friendship. Later in 1968, John divorced Cynthia, effectively abandoning his son Julian in the process. In 1969, John returned his MBE to the Crown, distancing himself from England and his identity as an Englishman. Later that year, during an argument with Paul in the studio, John declared, "I'm leaving the Beatles. I want a divorce, like I had from Cynthia." The Beatles broke up soon after. John and Yoko would forsake England for America the next year, never to return, effectively abandoning Aunt Mimi and all of his other relatives in England. Every role within John's identity, as husband to Cynthia, father to Julian, nephew and son to Mimi, son to Alf and Julia, client and close friend to Brian, songwriting partner and bandmate to Paul, and leader and frontman of the Beatles, were all dissolved by the end of the 1960s. The 1970s would, by necessity, be the decade in which John would have to reimagine John Lennon once again. In 1970, John received a pre-publication copy of a new book entitled The Primal Scream, Primal Therapy, The Cure for Neurosis, by American psychologist Arthur Yanov. Yanov's book was particularly relevant for John at that moment. In fact, John read the entire book in one sitting, shared it with Yoko, and then contacted Yanov immediately to begin therapy. In the first chapter, Yanov states that primal therapy has been applied successfully to a wide range of neuroses, including heroin addiction. At the time, John and Yoko were both struggling desperately with their addictions to heroin. Though John had kicked the habit in 1969 by going cold turkey, he and Yoko were now facing the hard part of sobriety, staying off of heroin. In his book, Yanov also explains how LSD upsets the defense system by allowing the user to access some of the primal memories associated with his neurosis, but in a way that's completely uncontrolled and incomprehensible for the user. The result is a partial re-experiencing of the primal trauma or pain, but without the benefit of being able to consciously work through it and understand it. Because LSD reawakens deeply repressed feelings that the user is psychologically unprepared to deal with, a bad trip is actually a psychological injury or trauma. Bad trip casualties, therefore, need another drug to deaden the pain that the LSD awakened. According to Yanov, one of the most effective deadeners is heroin. Just by reading the book, John understood how years of tripping had stripped away his ego defenses by dissolving his sense of self. John also learned that his heroin habit was self-medication. He was deadening the pain triggered by his traumatic childhood that was reawakened by his LSD use. In Yanov's words, the heroin addict has usually run out of internal defenses to stop the tension. Yanov's book addressed John's psychosocial issues as well. Since adolescence, John was always on the make for girls. Though he typically had a girlfriend or a wife, or both, John was a chronic philanderer. As an attractive rock star, John had multitudinous opportunities to score with his female fans, and he did so as much as possible. John's compulsive sexual behavior would be called sex addiction today, and it was troubling for him because he didn't understand why he constantly needed to have sex with women other than his girlfriend or wife, and why infinite casual sex with infinite partners was never enough. A person can be held by dozens of lovers, Yanov explains, and never resolve his need for warmth from a parent. Yanov relates compulsive sex to the primal pain of being an unloved or unwanted child. A loved child does not grow up into an adult with an insatiable craving for sex. He has been held and caressed by his parents and does not need to use sex to satisfy that early need. Yanov also explains why compulsive sexuality is just a symptom of a broader need to feel loved. For his entire life, John was performing. He always needed to be the center of attention. Music gave him the opportunity to satiate this need. As a rock star, John had the love, praise, and adulation of millions of women, and he personally had sex with hundreds of them. But why was it never enough? According to Yanov, a loved child has no need for praise because he has not been denigrated. Yanov's psychoanalytic explanation gave John insight into why he pushed himself so hard to scale the highest heights of stardom, and why even the highest level of stardom was never enough to make him feel good about himself. Yanov explains, the fascination of seeing our names in lights or on the printed page is but one indication of the deep deprivation in many of us of individual recognition. Those achievements, no matter how real, serve as a symbolic quest for parental love. Pleasing an audience becomes the struggle. Struggle is what keeps a child from feeling his hopelessness. It lies in overwork, in slaving for high grades, in being the performer. Struggle is the neurotic's hope of being loved. Instead of being himself, he struggles to become another version of himself. His struggle will cover his pain. After 20 years of covering his pain, John had recklessly ripped off the psychological bandage with acid and was now completely defenseless. The neurotic is trying to convert the world into caring, interested, warm parents, Yanov wrote. With this insight, John was able to look back at his recent world stage performances and see these interactions with the whole world as a symbol of his primal need for loving and peaceful parents. In his desperation and confusion, John was expressing the forlorn hope of a frightened little boy to turn the whole world into the peaceful and loving home that he never had. Because in the mind of a child, all a family is love. And love is all you need if his parents just stopped fighting and gave peace a chance. When John and Yoko phoned Dr. Yanov for help, they were living in Tittenhurst, a vast estate with everything anyone could ever need, and they were completely miserable. Yanov's book made it clear that material possessions do not resolve primal pain, because possessions are merely symbols of the inner need for the unloved inner child to feel loved. But symbols cannot relieve real psychological pain. In Yanov's words, there will never be enough alcohol, drugs, clothes, or money to fill the void. Now, hiding in his vast estate, crouching behind his wall of Yoko, John found that none of his old defenses worked anymore. He could no longer compensate for his deep insecurities by putting on the tough rocker performance, and for the first time in his life, he suffered from debilitating stage fright and social anxiety. Though John tried transcendental meditation as an alternative to LSD, that didn't work either. Yanov addresses transcendental meditation in his book, even mentioning John's former guru, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, by name. Yanov labeled meditation anti-primal because it involved detachment instead of connection, abnegation of self rather than feeling the self. According to Yanov, all neurotics experienced a primal scene in early childhood, a moment in which the trauma of their entire childhood was encapsulated and experienced in one harrowing moment. The only way to heal primal pain is to re-experience the primal scene at the root of the pain, feeling the pain and processing it consciously. The major primal scene is the single most shattering event in the child's life. It usually occurs between the ages of 5 and 7. The principal goal of primal therapy is to identify this scene, buried somewhere deep in the unconscious, to relive it, this time really feeling the pain for all of its agony and despair, and then discharging it in a cathartic emotional release. The primal scream. The dreadful scene in Blackpool, when a 5-year-old John was forced to choose between his mom and dad, was John's unmistakable primal scene. On top of that, John had been screaming into microphones his whole career and was well aware of the cathartic benefit of a good scream. In the studio, John would sometimes have to fight back tears when he sang because of the uncontrollable outflow of unconscious emotions that would flow out of him. So, in terms of Janov's treatment model, John had a head start in primal therapy because his acid experiences already offered him a glimpse of his real self, hidden behind all of his unreal defenses. John already knew how to release his emotions through a scream. And John was well aware of his childhood primal scene in Blackpool. The level of his pain was enormous, Janov recalled upon first meeting John. He was almost completely non-functional. He couldn't leave the house. He could hardly leave his room. He had no defenses. He was decompensating. He was just one big ball of pain. This was someone the whole world adored, and it didn't change a thing. At the center of all that fame and wealth and adulation was just a lonely little kid. Primal scream therapy with Janov convinced John once and for all that drugs were not helpful for mental health because they pacified the pain, like a pacifier for a baby, rather than dealing with it outright. Following treatment, John stopped doing heroin, and though he had issues with other substances later in life, his heroin problem was more or less under control, though the same could not be said for Yoko. Therapy helped John to understand that many of his identity issues were founded in his childhood and adolescent traumas, and that understanding helped him in his relationships. Yoko, in particular, noted that the intense jealousy and possessiveness that John felt towards her was gone, because he understood that those fears were merely symbolic remnants of his own mother issues from childhood. Therapy also helped John understand why he was always performing, and why external approval and validation was so important to him. It revealed to him why he was always seeking out gurus and mentors in desperate attempts to find himself by identifying with a father figure. Though Janov could easily be labeled as just another guru that John devoted himself to, only to become disenchanted and move on, it should be noted that after primal therapy, John didn't really have any more gurus or father figures playing major roles in his life. Also, while John would later disavow his temporary fascinations with Leary's dropout philosophy and the Maharishi's transcendentalism, and was known for speaking disparagingly of his former heroes, Elvis and Bob Dylan, John never disavowed his work with Janov and never spoke ill of the man himself. John sent inscribed copies of Janov's book to friends who were also dealing with similar issues, friends like Spike Milligan and Eric Clapton. Primal scream therapy helped John accept himself and find some inner peace, providing the source material for the most introspective and emotionally powerful songs that John would ever write and record. Once the Beatles were truly over, John was motivated to prove himself as a solo songwriter and recording artist, especially because Paul and George had such great successes with their solo projects, while John's experimental albums with Yoko didn't sell copies and were reviled by fans and critics alike. The original idea was to make a double album entitled Plastic Ono Band, with one record comprising John songs and with Yoko songs on the other record. Realizing that the inclusion of Yoko songs would hurt sales, the double album idea was scrapped. And two separate albums were released in 1970, both entitled Plastic Ono Band, both with the same cover art, but one with John songs and the other with Yoko's. Notwithstanding the initial confusion, John created a masterpiece. The songs dealt directly with the trauma of his early childhood. In the song Mother, John sings, "Mother, you had me, but I never had you. I wanted you, you didn't want me." In the second verse, John sings, Father, you left me. I never left you. I needed you so bad, you didn't need me. The psychosocial drama of John's childhood, adolescent, and adult lives were all expressed on that album through his primal screams. In the song God, John recognizes God as the elusive father figure he's always been searching for, whose distance from himself has always been measured in his own pain. The song is a declaration of psychological independence from all identity traps and false guides, an affirmation that he will stop chasing mystical dreams and live in the real world. Ultimately, the song is a statement about finding and accepting his own identity. I was the dream weaver, but now I'm reborn. I was the walrus, but now I'm John. The dream is over. While John's solo work on Plastic Ono Band was brilliant, the music itself was stark to go along with the brutally powerful lyrics, making the album as a whole not particularly commercial. The money in and of itself didn't matter to John, but his ongoing rivalry with Paul and the other Beatles did. Notwithstanding his lessons from primal therapy about ego defenses, he still needed to prove to himself that he could make a solo album that was just as successful commercially as the solo albums made by Paul and George. And that's precisely what John did on his second solo album, Imagine, released a year later in 1971. The title track from the album speaks for itself. Other tracks, such as Jealous Guy and Crippled Inside, continue the introspective, self-revealing style of songwriting that John showcased in his previous album, but with a fuller musical background. The album was very successful, and the title track would go on to become the signature song of John's career. As a musician and a songwriter, John had nothing left to prove. The next couple of years would find John and Yoko focusing more on political activism for left-wing causes, such as the anti-war movement and civil rights. As usual, John's tendency to overstate his case offended some people, such as in the song Woman is the N-word of the world. John's far-left stance and his anti-war activism did not endear him to the Nixon-era U.S. government, who identified him as a dangerous provocateur and hamstringed his ongoing attempts to get a green card. On the evening of November 11, 1972, John and Yoko attended a party at the New York City apartment of their friend, Jerry Rubin, a well-known political activist. It was meant to be a post-election party celebrating President Nixon's defeat, but the news of a Nixon landslide dampened the mood considerably. John was particularly affected by the bad news, as he knew that the Nixon administration was particularly hostile towards John's bid for U.S. residency. John was drinking, but now with a 1970s twist. He was snorting cocaine too, a bad combination for John. When John got drunk, he got uncontrollably angry, boisterous, and loud. Adding cocaine to the mix was like throwing gasoline on the fire, as it enabled John to drink endlessly without passing out. At the party, John met a girl and took her into a bedroom to have sex. Yoko later recalled that the girl had shown no sign of romantic interest in John at all. He just grabbed her by the arm and she went. This was a small apartment with thin walls, so everybody could hear them quite clearly, including Yoko. The bed they were using had everybody's coats on it, so nobody could leave the uncomfortable situation until John and the girl finished and opened the door. Everyone was just hanging around, very late at night, waiting for John to finish so they could get their coats and go home. Yoko recalled it was very embarrassing. In fact, Yoko was absolutely mortified. The election night incident was yet another act in John's theater of the absurd, but this time, Yoko wasn't in on the joke. The joke was on her, but nobody was laughing. Now Yoko knew how Cynthia felt, to be forced to witness firsthand her husband's intimacy with another woman, and for that husband to maliciously rub it in her face. John was testing Yoko, like he tested everyone, but this time the test failed. Yoko told John that she couldn't live with him anymore, and suggested that they separate. Returning to England was not a good option for John at the time because the American government, hostile towards his presence, was likely to bar him from returning if he left. And there were also legal issues regarding drug possession charges in England, as well as a ton of back taxes he owed the British Crown. Since Yoko was an artist and John a musician, it made sense for Yoko to stay in New York, the modern art capital of the world, while John could fly out west to LA, the capital of the pop music industry. Yoko knew that John always needed a partner in crime, and she also knew that he needed somebody to manage his personal and professional lives, as well as someone to monitor his drinking and drug use and to keep him away from groupies and junkies and other people who may harm or take advantage of him. In short, John needed a Yoko surrogate in LA, someone to be mommy, manager, lover, partner, bodyguard, driver, gopher, and assistant to John, all wrapped in one. Yoko selected May Pang, their 22-year-old assistant, for the position. May Pang was young and pretty, and John already liked her, so that made it easy. Though it may sound odd for a wife to select her husband's mistress, Yoko knew John was going to have sex with other women, so instead of fighting the inevitable, she controlled it. By attaching May Pang to her husband, Yoko could at least know that John's sexual partner wasn't going to hurt him, use him, infect him with diseases, or lure him away from Yoko forever. Yoko knew that May Pang would be there to dutifully report all of John's exploits directly to her, and to make sure John didn't get back into heroin or acid. So for 18 months, from mid-1973 through early 1975, John lived in LA with May Pang by his side, a constant partner. Yoko maintained daily contact with May Pang, calling her several times a day to deliver detailed instructions and receive updates about John's work and play. John and May Pang moved into a house in LA with fellow musicians: Ringo, Harry Nilsson, and Keith Moon. John referred to that year and a half away from Yoko as his lost weekend, because it all passed by in a haze of alcohol and cocaine. The house he was living in was always a party scene, and his gang of revelers became known as the Hollywood Vampires. According to Erik Erikson, at midlife, the crisis of identity involves either generating new life goals or stagnating by stalling or moving backwards in terms of identity development. In that sense, John's lost weekend was a midlife crisis, as he was regressing, moving back into heavy drinking and drug use, acting indulgently and irresponsibly, like a teenager. John recorded 3 albums between 1973 and 1975, but it was hardly his best work. At the same time, however, it could be argued that John was being quite generative during the lost weekend. Though his love life was unordinary, his time with May demonstrated to John that love, under the right circumstances, could be uncomplicated and unconflicted. And while the lost weekend period reflects a creative low point in John's career, there were some excellent highlights, such as the singles Mind Games, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, and Number 9 Dream. The lost weekend was a high point for John in terms of musical collaboration outside of the Beatles. John produced albums for his friends Harry Nilsson and Ringo Starr, and John collaborated with Elton John on the single Whatever Gets You Through the Night. And John also collaborated with David Bowie on the hit single Fame. On a psychosocial level, John was being more generative than ever before, actively reconnecting with estranged family and friends, with the help and encouragement of May Pang. The title of John's 1974 album, Walls and Bridges, reflects the fact that John had been burning bridges and building walls for 6 years. But now he was doubling back, building bridges and tearing down walls. Walls keep you in, either protectively or otherwise, John explained, and bridges get you somewhere else. John had been using Yoko as a wall. Knowing very well that his family and friends didn't like her, John used Yoko as a prerequisite for any contact with him. Anyone who wanted any contact whatsoever with John between 1968 and early 1973 had to go through Yoko. That was the rule, and there were no exceptions. John was an incredibly effective wall because the people who hated her and loved John would never want to deal with her, so they didn't. As a result, there had been no personal contact between John and Julian for over 4 years, and many of his other relationships were cordoned off behind a wall of Yoko. According to Cynthia, John seemed to be cutting all his ties with family and friends in Britain. He seldom, if ever, contacted his sisters, aunts, and the friends we had kept in touch with all through the Beatles' years. May Pang, however, played the bridge to Yoko's wall. Unlike Yoko, May was not only John's lover, she was his personal assistant, and she performed that job exceedingly well, helping John in every aspect of his life, and extending olive branches not only to those who loved his work, but to those that he loved and all but lost. She excelled at inviting people into John's life, while Yoko excelled at keeping people out. May was never interfering or bossy. Her assistance was always conscientious and courteous. And because she saw her purpose as assisting John, she never let her own ego and ambitions interfere with John's work in any way. Unlike Yoko, May certainly never attempted or asked to be inserted or included in any situation where her presence may have been unwelcome. It was May Pang's idea to reach out to Julian and Cynthia. The rift between John's ex-wife and son couldn't be breached by John because he created it, nor could it be breached by Yoko because she was the very thing John used to distance himself from them. In fact, the principal reason why Julian was never invited to spend time in New York with his father was because Julian's presence would remind Yoko of her own daughter's absence. Kyoko, at the time, was living in hiding with her father, Tony Cox, who was keeping her away from her mother in an ongoing custody dispute. Since neither Yoko nor Kyoko were in LA, May convinced John to allow her to contact Cynthia and invite her and Julian to America, which she did. For the first time in years, John and Julian spent time together as father and son, enjoying a day at Disneyland. The lines of communication were now reopened, and John and Julian would start seeing each other more regularly. May also helped John reconcile with George Harrison and Paul. George and John had a falling out in 1971 when John agreed to perform at George's Rockstar benefit concerts for Bangladesh. John presumed that the invitation included Yoko, but George's invitation to perform on stage for a world audience with the greatest rock stars certainly did not extend to Yoko. Without Yoko, John reneged on his promise to perform, hurting George's feelings in the process. At the same time, relations between John and Paul had been downright antagonistic since the Beatles broke up. With May Pang acting as a peacemaker, they all got together in LA and reconciled. Paul and John even jammed a bit, making tentative plans to work together once again in the future. For a weekend that was lost, John, with May's assistance, was quite productive, both professionally and personally. He was working consistently in the studio and collaborating with fellow musicians. He was reconciling with family, friends, and former Beatles. He was making new friends and enjoying his stress-free, expectation-free, and commitment-free love affair with May Pang. The low point of the lost weekend, obviously, was his cocaine use and drinking, which were completely out of control. Part of the problem was Harry Nilsson. John, as always, needed a partner in crime while in LA. May Pang didn't do drugs or drink, but Harry Nilsson did. A lot. John and Harry became very close friends. Their musical camaraderie in some ways mirrored his songwriting partnership with Paul. Harry, like Paul, was a brilliant songwriter with a full, warm voice that blended perfectly in harmony with John's edgier, more abrasive voice, just like it did with Paul's. However, while Paul was always a stabilizing force in John's life, Harry was the opposite. Rather than trying to curb John's drinking and drug use, Harry encouraged it and played the "I can drink you under the table" game with John. John admitted that his decadent lifestyle in LA was killing him, so he and May returned to New York to focus on finishing the studio work that was simply not getting done in LA due to all the partying. Back in the more sober and controlled environment of New York City, John would emerge from his long-lost weekend like a caterpillar from a cocoon, a new man, with a newfound maturity that would afford him a stable personal and professional life for the rest of his days, though those days were tragically numbered. When their single, Whatever Gets You Through the Night, hit #1 on the charts, John fulfilled his promise to Elton John by joining him on stage to perform it on Thanksgiving 1974 at Madison Square Garden in New York. The surprise guest performance was a huge return to form for John, overcoming his stage fright and playing his recent hit as well as 2 Beatles songs to gargantuan applause and acclaim. Christmas 1974 found John living with May Pang in Manhattan, enjoying an extended visit by Julian. Of that time, Julian recalled, "Dad and I got on a great deal better then. We had a lot of fun, laughed a lot, and had a great time in general when he was with May Pang. My memories of that time with Dad and May are very clear. They were the happiest time I can remember with them." John similarly told the biographer that his time with May had been the happiest I've ever been. John wrote a beautiful love song for May that's featured on the Walls and Bridges album. Then, on the day before John was planning to fly down to New Orleans to work with Paul and his band Wings on their next album, Yoko called. The call from Yoko, a few weeks after they met at the Thanksgiving concert, ostensibly concerned a new form of hypnotherapy that Yoko was doing to help her quit smoking. She thought it would help John quit as well, and so she ordered May to send John over to the Dakota, the Manhattan apartment building where Yoko and John owned apartments. At the time, John was planning on buying a house for he and May Pang. But Yoko insisted that the stars were aligned for them both to quit smoking, and they both believed in astrology. The hypnotherapy was an obvious front for Yoko's real intention, which was to take John back. John went to the Dakota and essentially never returned to the apartment he shared with May. He also never quit smoking. May Pang believes that Yoko used the hypnotherapy sessions to have John brainwashed. The next time she saw John, after the hypnotherapy sessions at the Dakota, he seemed dazed and disoriented and looked drawn and pale. John explained that the hypnotherapy sessions made him sick, but he was still smoking, and he also seemed strangely cold and aloof. John and Yoko were also uncharacteristically silent about the hypnotherapy, not revealing the practitioner or any of his methods, a silence that was not in keeping with their usual full media disclosures on the various therapies and cures they'd explored over the years. May Pang's quasi-plausible hypno-brainwashing theory would not have been out of character for Yoko, who was known for her extraordinary ability to control and manipulate others, especially John. Yoko's winner-take-all, cutthroat manner of taking John away from May was reminiscent of the ruthless way that Aunt Mimi took John away from Julia. The same could be said of the way that Yoko took John away from Cynthia, as Cynthia revealed in her memoirs that Yoko had been pursuing John relentlessly for years before winning him over. As for John, his sudden decision to return to Yoko and his quick frost towards May Pang was not at all out of character for him either. He did the same thing to Cynthia in 1968, and it was just as sudden and almost as cruel. John would still visit May from time to time over the next couple of years. He kept these rendezvous secret from Yoko. May Pang, for her part, still loved him very much, even though he was clearly casting her aside. John moved back to the Dakota to live with his wife, Yoko, and stayed there until his untimely death a few years later. In the end, only John and Yoko know the reasons for their reunion. Though John loved May, they were very different people. John was a very tough person to manage. He needed someone just as tough and pig-headed as he was to manage him. May was sweet, but not tough. May helped him rebuild the interpersonal relationships he fractured with Yoko. She also helped him rebuild his music career. in great part by simply not insisting that she put her own music onto each of John's records. May could not, however, control John, or keep him from destroying himself with alcohol, cocaine, and other tools of self-destruction. Yoko, it seems, was the only person John knew who was as tough and as crazy as he was. In that tough, crazy woman, he met his match, and he saw the reflection of his own need for control and security, coming to believe that only she could provide him with the control and security he so desperately needed. All his life, John was searching for a mother figure to provide not only love and affection, but also control and security over his own reckless and self-destructive impulses. His insecure relationship patterns and his insecure sense of identity reflected that need. Julia gave him love and affection, but also made him feel insecure because she had neglected and abandoned him. Mimi was a strong woman who offered control and security, but she was also cold, critical, unaffectionate, and withholding of love. Cynthia offered John the love and affection he needed so badly, especially after the deaths of his mother and beloved uncle. They married when she got pregnant, but they weren't right for each other either. Cynthia wasn't strong enough to stand up to John, and what he needed most of all was someone who could dominate him, someone who could overpower him psychologically and keep him under control. Yoko, for all her faults, was that dominating someone. 7 years older than John, she was psychologically domineering and extremely controlling. He began calling her mother many years before she gave birth to their son, indicating her role as a mother to John as well as a lover. Cynthia came to the same conclusion, writing in her memoir, "While I had offered the devotion and loving acceptance that he needed after his mother's death, Yoko offered the security of a mother figure who always knew best. When, in later years, I read comments from Yoko comparing herself to Aunt Mimi, I had to smile. She'd got it dead right." In the spring of 1975, Yoko became pregnant with John's baby. John was ecstatic at the news that he could get a second chance at fatherhood. The symbolism behind the birth of a second child and the psychological rebirth of the child's father was too clear to be missed. However, Yoko was 42 years old at the time. Maternal old age, as well as several previous miscarriages and abortions, put her pregnancy in a high-risk category. She had already miscarried once with John in 1968, shortly after John's divorce from Cynthia was finalized, and she would miscarry 2 more times over the next few years. The pregnancy, the symbolic rebirth for John, the romantic reunion after their long separation, and a nurturing instinct evoked by Yoko's precarious medical condition all combined to cement the reunited couple together in a much stronger bond. John set aside his studio work indefinitely in order to focus on fatherhood. "I'm blessed with a second chance," he said. "I've already lost one family to produce what? Sgt. Pepper?" Sean Ono Taro Lennon was born on October 5, 1975. John's application for a United States green card was approved the previous day, ending his long-lasting immigration problems. John was not only reborn as a loving, caring, doting father, he was reborn as an American as well. Yoko was not the stay-at-home mother type, so while she was focusing on business and her own artistic and musical pursuits, someone else would have to focus on taking care of the baby. It was John's decision to drop out of showbiz in order to be a house husband and stay-at-home dad for Sean. Though photos of John baking bread with Sean at the Dakota and otherwise being a dutiful parent were produced as evidence of John's rebirth as a super dad, there was no shortage of nannies, cooks, maids, personal assistants, and other helpful folk to lend a hand. John was a loving and caring father to Sean, but he was also super rich, and he was still John Lennon, so he never had to change a poopy diaper if he didn't feel like it, nor was he chained to Sean's crib. Nonetheless, the discrepancy between John's total devotion to Sean and Yoko in the 5 years between the birth of his son and his violent death And the near total neglect and indifference he showed towards Julian and Cynthia in the 1960s through the early 1970s is quite stark. This 180-degree personality flip for John was lovely for Yoko and Sean, but it must have been incredibly painful for Cynthia and Julian. Julian was not a materialistic child, Cynthia wrote in her autobiography, but he was sensitive, and he could not help noticing the gifts, time, and attention that his father lavished on his brother. Nevertheless, in his house husband years, John did try to get closer to Julian, seeing much more of him than he had in the previous 12 years. John also tried to be kinder and gentler to Cynthia, and he began communicating regularly with his old friends and family members who he'd lost touch with, like Pete Shotton and his half-sisters. John and Paul were speaking to each other regularly, and in the spring of 1976, John got a phone call from his stepmother, Pauline, who was 8 years younger than John, telling him that his father, the ignoble Alf, was in hospital, dying of cancer. Prior to his divorce with Cynthia, John had appeased Alf by giving him and his young bride, Pauline, low-paying jobs at Apple. Pauline would occasionally babysit for Julian, and in time, she also gave birth to 2 sons, John's half-brothers. Realizing at last that his father was not a bad man, but a roguish drunkard who could barely manage his own life, John had come to terms with his father's limitations, and allowed he and his wife to retain a somewhat benign presence on the outskirts of his life. Stories about Alf's drunken escapades were amusing family anecdotes now, rather than ammunition to be used against him by the Stanley family. Once, in the 1940s, for instance, Alf broke a shop window while drunk because he'd fallen in love with a storefront mannequin. He was still dancing with the mannequin in the middle of the street when the cops came to arrest him. John had little contact with Alf in the late 1960s, but in 1970, shortly after John and Yoko completed their stint with primal scream therapy, Alf wrote to John, stating that he was intending to write an autobiography. A meeting was called, and Alf and Pauline, carrying little David, John's baby half-brother, went to meet John in his mansion in Tittenhurst on October 9, 1970, John's 30th birthday. This was the first time that Alf and Pauline had been invited to Tittenhurst, and they were thinking this was going to be a nice little family birthday party. Alf and his young wife arrived bearing a card and a present, and were kept waiting in the kitchen. After what seemed like an interminable wait, John arrived in a petulant state. Before Alf could get a word out, John screamed at him, "I want you out of my house and I'm cutting off your money. Get out of my life and off of my back." John was presuming that his father's autobiography was just another scheme to make money off of the Lennon name, and the timing of the meeting was incredibly poor. John had just gone through primal scream therapy. His feelings about his father and his traumatic childhood were open wounds. The premise of primal scream therapy was that neurosis forms and festers when pain is held in and not released. So John did what he thought Yanov would want him to do. He screamed. According to Pauline, John railed against his father, shouting at the top of his lungs, recalling his childhood abandonment and unleashing a tirade of anger, bile, and hate that had been locked down in the depths of John's psyche since he was a 5-year-old boy in Blackpool, forced to choose between his mommy and daddy in his primal scene. John physically threatened his father, telling him that he'd have him killed if he wrote anything about John and his life, and he even referred to Julia as a whore. Alf and Pauline were hurt and dumbstruck by John's vicious sandbagging. True to his word, John instructed the Apple accountants to cut off all support to his father, stepmother, and half-brother, dismissing them from their positions at Apple, canceling their stipends, and evicting them from their home, which was owned by Apple. John's threats were so salient and terrifying that Alf actually feared for his life, submitting a detailed account of the meeting with his lawyer, in case he was to die soon, under suspicious circumstances. That was the last time John and Alf would ever see each other. 6 years later, when John learned that his father was on his deathbed, he called Alf on the phone, and they reconciled. John apologized for his anger and cruelty at their last meeting. Alf did go ahead and write his autobiography, but he did not publish it, respecting John's wishes. Instead, he bequeathed the unpublished manuscript to John in his will. After Alf died and John read his father's story, John noted with regret, "You know, all he wanted was for me to hear his side of the story, which I hadn't heard." Though it happened too late to salvage their relationship, John finally realized that his father was not the complete scoundrel that Aunt Mimi had painted him out to be. If anything, Julia was the one who really destroyed the marriage between she and Alf, and it was Mimi and the Stanley family who really conspired to keep Alf out of John's life for his entire childhood. The death of his father, following a lifetime of anger and resentment on his part, no doubt increased John's commitment to his own newborn son, Sean. John was determined not to replay the same mistakes his own father made, and to reverse the mistakes he'd already made as a father to Julian. After Sean's birth, John retreated to safety behind Yoko's wall. A switchboard was set up in the Dakota, in which all calls to John went through Yoko's private line. The wall was thick. Old friends and colleagues like Mick Jagger, Harry Nilsson, and Keith Moon complained that they could never get through to John on the telephone. Yoko was filtering out anyone who may encourage John to drink or do drugs or engage in other shenanigans with groupies or other bad influences. John was certainly aware of this. He seemed to adopt a mother knows best philosophy regarding Yoko's wall. Indeed, John referred to Yoko only as mother now, in reference to both her status as the mother of his baby and to his own rebirth, again, through Yoko via Sean. It's clear from the reports of friends and family that John was a stable presence in Sean's life, but he certainly wasn't spending all of his time taking care of Sean. He also wasn't recording or writing songs either. So the question remains, what exactly was John doing from mid-1975 to early 1980? In addition to supporting Yoko in her pregnancy and doting on Sean for periods of time, it's most likely that John's main focus during the late 1970s was on keeping sober. Yoko's need to remain completely clean during her high-risk pregnancy and John's need to feel completely connected to her during the whole process was the gauntlet thrown by fatherhood that John picked up with vigor. John was fighting man-to-man with his lifelong struggle with substance abuse. "I've always needed to be on a drug," John admitted in an interview. "The basic thing nobody asks is why do people take drugs of any sort? Why do we have these accessories to normal living to live? I mean, is there something wrong with society that makes us so pressurized that we cannot live without guarding ourselves against it?" By 1980, John was getting the itch to return to the studio. The recent hit Paul had scored with his single, Coming Up, may have been the impetus. John's rivalry with Paul had always been a primary motivator. Released in 1980, Double Fantasy contained some of John's greatest love songs, such as Woman and Dear Yoko, Just Like Starting Over, and Beautiful Boy. On December 8, 1980, Annie Leibovitz took the infamous photograph that would soon grace the cover of Rolling Stone magazine. It was a Polaroid picture, so the couple saw the photo immediately. "This is it," John screamed. "You captured our relationship exactly." Later that evening, John and Yoko returned home to the Dakota, where Mark David Chapman shot John down in cold blood. The foremost spokesman of his generation was brought down by a random, meaningless act of violence perpetrated by a confused and disturbed man who didn't know John at all, and was still enraged over the Jesus comment made 16 years earlier by a 24-year-old John, who was most probably stoned or on acid when he said it. Though John was robbed of his final act by a madman with a gun, John's final stage of life was filled with integrity. John was working hard on becoming a better father, a better husband, and a better person. He had worked through the primordial trauma of his childhood through much toil, trial, and error. As a father to Julian, John embodied Alf, whose absence as a young father damaged his relationship with his son. Like Alf, John did love his son very much, but he was unable to provide a stable and secure fatherly presence in his life. Also, like Alf, John tried to make up for his mistakes with Julian later on. As a father to Sean, John was able to resurrect the warm, kind, nurturing, stable father figure he had in his Uncle George. Here was the father who took his son on fun day trips, played music, sang songs, read bedtime stories, exchanged hugs and squeakers, and tucked his son in at night with a lullaby. For the rest of us, John left us his music and his challenge to all of us to imagine new realities, and to fearlessly question our identities and our ways of being, to ask the questions others are afraid to ask.